As you're building a WPF application and you're laying out the user interface, you'll take advantage of all of the WPF controls, text blocks and text boxes and list boxes, etc., etc. But there will be times when you'll come across the desire to have a control that's not in WPF. A good example is the masked text box, which is in Windows Forms but not in WPF. Or you might want to reuse existing Windows Forms user controls rather than recreate them in WPF. Well, you can add a Windows Forms built-in or user control to a WPF window. And all you need to do is add references to the assemblies that Windows Forms needs. And you can create a new Windows Forms user control in Visual Studio inside a WPF application. And then, of course, Visual Studio will add the references that you need. And then to actually have this Windows Forms control or user control show up in your WPF application, you use the Windows Forms host control. And this control is a container for a Windows Forms control. It's in the system.windows.forms.integration namespace. And if you want programmatic access to the control itself, to the control that's being hosted, then you can call the child property. So the child property of the Windows Forms host control references that Windows Forms control being hosted by the Windows Forms host control. Now each Windows Forms host control can contain only one Windows Forms control. So if you want to have a masked text box and 3 user controls, then you'll need 4 instances of the Windows Forms host control. You can add it in XAML or you can drag it from the toolbox either way. And then if you need to set properties of the Windows Forms control, you can do that either in XAML or in the Properties window. So let's see how to use this Windows Forms host control to add built-in Windows Forms controls and Windows Forms user controls to a WPF application. I have the Interop Demo 3 project open, and this is a WPF application. And right now it has 3 windows, each of which is a different example of a UI that gives users the ability to register. Now let's run this application, and let's look at our starting point. So I click Register User 1, and the user can come in here and register. So I can enter my name, and I can enter my phone number, 425-555-1212. I think I forgot how many numbers I was typing. You just saw the problem, didn't you? And my password, and I click OK. Robert, you are now registered. So yeah, we got the user's name. The password was showing up. The password was being hidden. But the problem is, I want to make the user enter a correct phone number. If the user misspells their own name, that's not my problem. I look at this and go, oh, that's probably a typo. The computer looks at this and goes, letters, that's valid. I mean, who knows what somebody's name is. But a phone number, what I really want is for the user to enter their phone number in the standard format for North American phone numbers. I don't want them entering letters. I don't want them entering too few digits. I certainly don't want them entering too many digits. And so this comes across my desk as the developer, and I sit back and I think, what can I do here? Well, I could validate that, and I could use regular expressions, and I could tell the user after the fact, hey, that's not a valid phone number. Please enter a valid one that looks like this. What I'd really like is for essentially to more encourage, some might say force, but I'll say encourage the users to enter the phone number correctly. And I think to myself, well, how can I do that? I guess I could go see if anybody has a WPF control that already does that. But then it occurs to me, if this is a Windows Forms application, I'd just use a masked text box. And how come WPF doesn't have a masked text box? Well, Windows Forms does, and I can use that Windows Forms masked text box in the WPF application. And that's what I'm going to do in this second example. I'm going to add right here a masked text box. Now the first thing I need is a reference. I need two of them actually. I need a reference to system.windows.forms because that's where the Windows Forms built-in controls are. And then because I'm doing interop, I also need a reference to Windows Forms integration. Okay, now I can open up register user 2. And we're going to type some XAML in here. I'm going to be using a Windows Forms control, so I need to map to the system.windows.forms namespace. So I do that in the XAML at the top, XML-NS. I can call this whatever I want. I'll call it WinForms. And then equal. And then I start typing CLR-namespace. And then I start typing system.windows.forms, and then it occurs to me that I should look in the IntelliSense because it might be in here. And if I scroll down far enough and don't pass it, here's system.windows.forms. I double click on that and Visual Studio fills out the rest for me. So the namespace is system.windows.forms and the assembly is system.windows.forms. Okay, the next thing I need is a Windows Forms host control that will host my Windows Forms control. So I will add that Windows Forms host, and I'm going to put it in the first row of the grid, in the second column of the grid. I said first row, second row of the grid, second column. I typed it correctly, good thing. And I want this to have a height of 25 and a width of 150. It doesn't literally matter actually because the masked text box is a fixed size. But just for aesthetic purposes, I want this to sort of match the other text boxes. I want the horizontal alignment to be equal to left, left, and I want a margin of 10, 0, 0, 0. And then finally, the Windows Forms control will show up using the default fonts that Windows Forms controls use. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to a font that is closer to what my Windows actually using. So I'll set the font family to Seago UI, and I'll set the font size, let's pick 11. That's a guess. Should be pretty close though. Okay, so now you see why I set the height and the width so that this appears the same height and width as these. It actually doesn't matter because the masked text box is a fixed size, but I like the symmetry. Okay, so now I have created a container. This Windows Forms host control can contain a Windows Forms control. It would be lovely if I could go to the toolbox, select Windows Forms controls, and then drag this into there. Or if I could right-click and there would be a choice here that says select the Windows Forms control that you want. Neither of those exist, so I have to type this. So I reference the WinForms namespace. And happily, the IntelliSense shows me all the Windows Forms controls. That's nice. So I just select masked text box, give it a name, phone masked text box, and now I need to fill out the mask property. In Windows Forms, I have a dialog box that has a number of built-in masks. I don't get that here, so I'll just have to type this by hand. Okay. So now, let's run this. And when I call up register user 2, here's the username, which is a WPF control. Here's the masked text box, which is a Windows Forms control. I can't type letters. I fill out the phone number the way it was meant to be filled out, enter my password, and life is good. Now I don't literally have to type this Windows Forms host. I could have gone into the toolbox Come on. If I click in here, there they are. I could have gone into the toolbox and come down here and found a Windows Forms host control and then dragged it onto my window, right into there. And then I could have adjusted the properties. I still have to type the masked text box part of it, but I could have dragged and dropped to create the Windows Forms host. And then to set the mask, I can do that in XAML. I can also do that in the Properties window. So come up with the Properties window. If I click here, I've selected the Windows Forms host control. That certainly doesn't have a mask property. But if I go into the document outline, I can select the actual masked text box, which does have a mask property, so I could set that here. Again, I don't get the ellipsis with the dialog box showing me all the built-in choices, but I can set the mask property using the Properties window. Now, username, phone number, password, labels, and text boxes seems like a good candidate for creating a user control out of. And I could certainly create a WPF user control out of this, but maybe I want this in both my Windows Forms and my WPF applications, so I want to create a Windows Forms user control that features the UI that we would need to register somebody. If I have an existing one, I can just add it to this project. I actually don't, so I'm going to create a new one. So I'll create a new item, and I'll go to Windows Forms and I'll select User Control. And I will call this Register User Control. And Visual Studio shows me the User Control Designer. I'm going to set some properties of this. Again, I want the font changed. I want Seago UI 11. And I want this sized a little differently. I want it to be about 300 wide and 175 tall. That's about right. And now I'm going to add controls to it. The toolbox shows me WinForms controls because I am creating a Windows Forms user control. I want a label, and this label is going to say username. Then I want a second label that will say phone number. And then finally, a label for password. And let's make these all lined up, and equally spaced. Good. Now, I need a text box for username. Where's the purple line? There it is. I had it. Disappeared. Perfect. This is the username text box. I want it to be about 150 wide. Then I want a masked text box for the phone number. We're in Windows Forms, so we'll obviously use the Windows Forms masked text box control. And we will call this phone masked text box, and then come down here and select the mask using the dialog box that shows me all the built-in ones. And then the last thing I need is a text box for the password, which I will call password text box, and specify that the password character is star. And then I'll make this a little shorter. All right, good enough. Now, what I want to be able to do is capture what the user enters for the username. So I'm going to create a public property here. Public string username. And get set there. And then when the user types in their username, I'll say this dot username equals username text box dot text. And now, when the user types their name, that will be stored in this property, and I'll be able to call that from my WPF application. So let's save this, let's build it. Come into our third window, register user 3, which has just OK and cancel buttons in it. I want that user control to go right here. If I go into the toolbox, why do they, I guess I have to have, there they are. I guess I'm impatient. It'd be nice if that user control showed up here, but it doesn't, so I'm going to have to do some typing in XAML. I need to reference the application's namespace, XMLNS, call it local, equals CLR-interop demo 3. Okay, and then again I need a Windows Forms host control, which I'm going to put right here. Windows Forms host. Give it a name, Windows Forms host. And put it in the first row of the grid. And then what goes in it? What goes in it is local register user control. So now let's build this. Oh, I figured it was a typo. CLR namespace interrupt demo 3. There we go. Okay, and then the last thing I want to do, well, first let's run this and make sure it shows up. There's the user control. Should have added a little bit more margin there, huh? Windows Forms host margin, oh, let's say 10, 20, 0, 0. 10, 10. Good, something like that. Okay, so when the user clicks OK, what I want to do is display their name. So I'm going to, in a message box, show string.format, and I'm going to say username, you are now registered. So I need to know the username. Now I can't just talk directly to the register user control. What I can do is talk to the Windows Form host control and get its child property. So what I'm going to do is, I can do this, I can say Windows Forms host dot child, and that references the control, and then what I want to do is cast that to a register user control so that I can read the username property. I need another parenthesis here so that I can read the username property. And now I can enter my username. I enter the phone number. I enter my password, I click OK. Robert, you are now registered. So I can add new Windows Forms user controls to a WPF application. I can use existing Windows Forms controls or existing Windows Forms user controls. That gives me not only the ability to add controls that I don't have in WPF, but it gives me the ability to reuse existing user controls. You just saw how to add Windows Forms built-in controls and user controls to a WPF application. Let's look at the flip side. Can you add WPF controls to a WinForms application? You can add a WPF built-in or user control to a Windows form. And you just need to add references to the needed assemblies. This is becoming familiar. Now, would you use a WPF user control in a Windows Forms application? Well, Windows Forms has a list box, WPF has a list box. Windows Forms has a text box, so does WPF. So there may or may not be times when you'll literally use a single WPF control. But you can think of lots of scenarios where you would use WPF user controls and be able to take advantage of the containership model. So for example, yes, Windows Forms has a list box, but it does not have a list box that easily lets you show images and text and other things. So I think you'll wind up more likely taking advantage of the user controls than the built-in controls, but you certainly can. And you can create a new WPF user control in a Windows Forms application, or of course use an existing one. If you create the new one, Visual Studio adds the references you need. How do you use this WPF control at runtime in your Windows Forms application? By using the element host control. And just as the Windows Forms host control was a container for a Windows Forms control, the element host control is a container for a WPF control. It's in the system.windows.forms.integration namespace. If you want to reference the control you're hosting, then you use the child property of the element host control. And if you're using a WPF user control, then Visual Studio provides design time support for this. You can add an element host control in code or drag it from the toolbox, and then you can set properties of the WPF control either in code or in the properties window. So let's go see how to use the element host control to add WPF user elements to a Windows Forms application. I have the Interop Demo 4 project open. This is a Windows Forms application that will let me look at some app dev courses and experts. So let's run this and let's see where we might be able to improve it by using UI elements based on WPF. So here's the main window. It's not too bad. Nice graphic, buttons for viewing courses and experts. Yeah, we can make it a little bit more visually appealing with WPF, and it would look a lot more visually appealing if I had a different Windows theme. But I don't know how much better we can make this look with WPF and if it would be worth it. Let's look at courses. I can double-click on a course to learn more about it. And I don't know, this is pretty good. It's a list. I can select something out of the list. Oh, interestingly, I can just single-click. I don't have to double-click. Okay, so other than the typo, I don't know how much we could improve this with WPF. Maybe if we wanted to add additional information on the courses in there. But for just the simple list, click and then go do something, this is pretty good. Let's view the experts. Now, take one look at this and we're pretty sure we can do better. Select an expert. Again, select an expert to learn more about him. When I click the expert's name, then I see the picture and the bio. And if I want to look at them one by one, I have to click one by one. And to go back, I have to click. We can do better than this. Because I know that we could create a list box here that shows the picture and the bio and therefore has the name. We could do this all at once. And as far as this application goes, If I select an expert and click vote, then I have voted for that expert. Don Kiley right now is my favorite app dev expert. Okay, so let's redo this. So experts 2, I want to add a WPF user control right here that does a better job of displaying experts. Now if I already had a WPF user control that did that, well then I could just add it. But I don't, so let's create one. So I'm going to add a new item. I'll select WPF and I'll create a new WPF user control and I will call it Experts User Control. Visual Studio adds some references: Presentation Core, Presentation Framework, Windows Base. Those are required by the designer. They're not actually enough to actually run this. So I literally need one more. I need system.xaml. System.xaml, I will add. These are the minimum ones I need to run this WPF user control. Windows Base, system.xaml, and then Presentation Core and Presentation Framework. Okay, so now what I can do is start filling this out. I can write my XAML and add my code to display the experts. So I'm going to change the design height from 300 by 300 to 500 by 500 because I want a little more room there. And then I have a bunch of XAML that's going to go in here, and I'm not going to type any of it. I'm going to go to the finished version of this application and copy and paste. So it is in expertsusercontrol.xaml, and it is all of this. So let's copy that, close this so I don't get confused as to which version is open, and then enter this, and we can see this is a much better version of this than we had before. We see the experts' pictures, we see text. I might actually make this a little bit wider. Although this is at design time, that doesn't necessarily mean it's wide enough at runtime. But there we go. So now we're going to add this into our Windows Forms application. But when I click Vote, I still want to know which expert I selected. So the list box has a selection changed event. Let's write some code in there. First thing I'm going to do is create a public property, public string, and I'll call it selected expert. And then I need get and set. And I'm also going to, in here, add using system.windows.controls. And then I'm going to write some code in here to find out who I selected. Now, how am I going to do that? Each item in the list box is a stack panel, and that stack panel contains an image and a text block. And the text block contains the instructor's bio, and then in this tag, their name. So what I want to do is I want to say, get me the tag property of the text block in the stack panel that is the selected item. So here's the code to do that. Let's create a text block, and then we'll call it expert text. And we're going to set that equal to the following. Well, first we know that experts list box has a selected item, has a selected value I'm going to use. And what I want to do is cast that to a stack panel, because I know it's an object. It's an object in code, but I know it's really a stack panel. So the first thing I'm going to do is cast that to stack panel. Okay, so at this point I have a reference to all of this. What I want to do is get to the text block that's in there. The stack panel has a property, because it's a container, it has a children property. So I'm going to say, get me the children of this. And I don't want all the children. I want the children of type, which is generic. So I'll say text block. So that says, get me a list of all of the text blocks in the stack panel. Now I know there's only one, but this is an IEnumerable. So I can say first or default. Either one will work. So let's say first. So now I've said this expert text block is the text block that's in the stack panel that is whatever you selected in the list box. And now all I need to do is read the tag property. Now that I have a reference to that text block, it's pretty easy to set selected expert equal to expert text dot tag dot toString. There we go. So now we can pass the name of the selected expert back to the host application, which is the Windows Forms application. Let's save this. Let's build it. Now let's go into the second version of this Windows Form, Experts 2, and let's add that user control to it. Because I built this, pretty cool, it shows up in the toolbox, so all I need to do is drag Experts user control out of the toolbox into my form. Visual Studio creates an element host for me and populates it with Experts user control. And then all I have to do is resize this. Sure, that's not wide enough, so let's do this. That looks like it'll be better. The images don't show up right now, but I can see all the text. Alright, that looks good. And if I really cared, I would widen this so it's centered. Okay, one last thing to do is in the code that runs when I click vote, get a reference to the selected expert property. So I'm going to say messagebox.show string.format you selected what? Well, I know that element host 1 is the control hosting the user control, and I know it has a child property, and I know this is an object at runtime. So I can cast this to experts user control, and then I should be able to read the selected expert property, which is a string. And there we go. So now, when I run this, view the active experts, come into main form and say don't run the old ugly version, run the new and improved beautiful version. There we go. Oh, this is awesome. So now in my Windows Forms application, I have this beautiful list box. As I scroll up and down, I can see the instructor's pictures and read all about them, and this is dramatically better. And then I can select an instructor, and when I click vote, I know who I voted for. I have an additional option as to how I get this element host onto this window. What I did was I dragged the user control out of the toolbox, and Visual Studio wrapped it in an element host. What I could also do is go down to the WPF Interoperability tab and drag an element host onto here, and then select Experts User Control. And then, of course, resize this. Or what I could also do is drag the element host on here, and then go into the Properties window and set the child property to Experts User Control. The end result is exactly the same, I guess there's one other option. I could set the child property at runtime. But at any rate, what I wind up with, regardless of the technique I use, I wind up with this great example of how and why you would use WPF in a Windows Forms application to provide a much better UI.